Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to look at a final market structure. And it usually only appears in factor markets, so that's why we're studying it here. But it's the type of market where there is only one or very few buyers of a good. That's known as monopsony. Let's get started. Okay, so the first thing to know is that monopsonies actually can exist in product markets too. It's any market in which there is one or very few buyers. So it does show up more often as a factor market. And that's why we're talking about it in this context. Labor markets is usually where it shows up, where there's only one or very few people, companies, that is to say, firms that are doing hiring, right? And you could think of some examples, like maybe a truck stop town with fast food restaurants, right? You might only have two fast food restaurants that are hiring in town. You might have what's known as a company town from the early 1900s, right? In the early 1900s, we had company towns like Pullman. It'd be nice if I could spell Pullman, Illinois, was a company town where the entire town was really just had one employer, and it was the Pullman Railroad Car Company. So there's lots and lots of examples where there's company towns out there. But what's kind of interesting in these markets is that it's the similar problem to what happens with monopoly, similar to monopoly. Monopoly, right? And so being careful here, monopsony, monopoly, it's very similar in that there's just one or very few buyers in this case, rather than one or very few sellers. Before we go any farther with it, it's important to kind of observe something that happens with marginal factor cost and wages. And I've put a big box around this here because this just represents like supply. And I think I even put here, note QLNW equals supply. This is the supply function. And so what I would kind of graph is if you had kind of, for example, a quantity of labor and a wage, I could graph this function, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just say it's like an upward sloping line, right? That's the supply of labor. So at 1, it would be 1, and at 2, it would be 2, and so forth, right? So this is just saying, like, if I pay a higher wage, people are willing and able to work more quantity in terms of how much they're willing to do. But what I will find is that after the first worker, the marginal factor cost of hiring workers is actually higher than the wage that I pay them. So the supply curve tells me the wage that I pay them, but the cost to the company is actually going to be higher and higher than that wage, much like we saw with monopoly, where you had a downward sloping demand versus MR, right? And so this is a very similar concept here, but what we're going to be talking about is marginal factor cost. Now, to show you that, the total cost of one worker would be $1. Total cost of 2 workers is 4. The total cost of 3 workers is 6. Is 4 times 4 is 16. I don't know why that was so hard for me all of a sudden, and 25. And so you can see that if we were to calculate what's the marginal factor cost, well, the marginal factor cost of the first worker is, if we didn't have any workers at all, then total cost would be 0 here. So it would be 1. The marginal factor cost of the next one's 3. And then this is not 6, this is 9. That's why I was having a brain fart a moment ago. This is 5 and 7 and then 9. There you go again, right? 3 times 3 is not 6, gloss, it's 9. I don't know why this is so hard today. My brain is not turned on. But in short, this marginal factor cost reflects the cost to hire each of these workers. And the reason why it would cost $3 to hire the second worker and not just the 2 it costs to hire them is because when I go to hire the second worker, I am a single wage payer, right? I am a single wage firm. And this means that I'm going to pay all of my workers. If I'm hiring 2, I'm going to pay them all $2 an hour. I'm not a wage discriminator. And we'll come back and kind of talk about what that might be later if I'm a wage discriminator and what that could look like. But when I go to hire the third worker, I pay them 3, but I also have to pay the first and the second worker an extra $1. And so they don't just cost 3, they cost 5 because I had to pay the first and the second worker an extra $1 each. If I go to hire the fourth worker, I pay them 4, but I also have to pay the 3 preceding workers an additional $1 on top of the 3 that they were earning. So it's not just 4, but it's 4 plus 3, which is 7. If I go to hire the fifth worker costs my company not just the $5 that I pay them, but the additional $4 that I have to pay all those other workers. So cost me 9. So in other words, we have this upward sloping marginal factor cost curve. And we can even say that, the factor cost would be 3 for the second worker, right? And that for the third worker, sure, they might get paid a wage of 3, but their marginal factor cost would be way up here, it would be 5. And so you can kind of see that each of these workers, as we go to hire an additional one, is going to cost us larger and larger amounts. So let's go ahead and graph what a monopsony labor market would kind of look like with all of the other pieces that we need. So just like with a monopoly, we're only going to do one graph. And so I left you quite a bit of space here. We are going to start with the supply curve. So it's a little bit tricky, but I like to put supply curve equals the wage. That's not probably technically accurate to do that because the wage is over here on this axis. You can see out of habit I wrote price. So then we have a marginal factor cost that's coming up like that. And then our demand curve is our standard marginal revenue product curve. And that is the demand for labor that this firm pays. So I've done demand for labor. I've done the supply curve, which is the wage. I've done the marginal factor cost. The quantity that they hire is determined by MRP equals MFC. So that's the same process as before, right? So we hire up to MRP equals MFC. Up to the quantity, we should say. And then I pay them W star. So I pay on the supply curve. So just like I price on the demand curve for a monopoly, I pay on the supply curve. I'm not actually paying them this value up here. I am paying them what the supply curve has. Now, in a competitive market, right, we can kind of show that this would be the optimal. And this right here is our optimal. Is our optimal quantity of workers. And so you can see they underhire. They don't hire enough workers compared to what would be a allocatively efficient market. And so this does have deadweight loss. It's this area that's bounded by the supply curve and the demand curve. And so we can actually say that the optimal, right, P opt wage and the Q opt kind of quantity over here, they underpay, right? So they underpay, and they underhire is a way to say this. So they're kind of pernicious in a lot of ways, right? They don't hire enough workers and they don't pay the ones that they hire enough compared to what would be considered optimal in a competitive market. And so we can actually use, this is kind of a really interesting final lesson that I like, especially if you're pretty bright about it. You can wrap your head around this. We can use a price control, just like we use with monopoly. We use a price ceiling. So monopoly, we use a price ceiling. So for monopsony, we use a price floor. And what's kind of nice is we have a handy price floor, which is called a minimum wage. And in fact, we can impose a minimum wage into this market and force this firm to hire more workers and pay them more. The implications of that, I think, are kind of astounding in a way, because a lot of folks are really uncomfortable with that notion that you have the ability to force a company to pay its workers more, right? MRP, and when they do that, they're actually going to. So this is Q opt. And we would actually hire that quantity. Whoa, that's not quite horizontal. This would be W opt. They would actually hire this quantity of workers, and they would actually increase from Q star, and they would increase their wages from W star. So kind of to finish that graph there, by imposing this minimum wage at this optimal value, it actually causes the marginal factor cost curve to flip on its side and become kind of part of this horizontal line, right? This minimum wage is equal to the new marginal factor cost. And so then they do produce at the quantity where MRP equals MFC. They just happen to produce there. And so they're paying a higher wage and they're producing more units, and it eliminates the deadweight loss. I think it's just such a really cool phenomena. It's something that deserves further study in economics, and there's lots and lots of people who are researching this. But I hope that it helped you kind of understanding a little bit about monopsony. Monopsony is also an example of a market failure. So it's a really good transition into our second topic, which is market failures. So I hope this helped you. I'll see you next time.